Okay, so still back to books. And yes, I have a fan going on in the back. Summer has started. We're going to see if noise reduction works well with this, and if not, well, lesson learned. So this is about Dombey Son. This is the first novel Dickens actually plotted out before he started writing. In the prior books, he generally had a scheme. Well, actually, the first book, the Pickwick Papers, he had no scheme whatsoever, and something gelled towards the end. And you can tell it's kind of episodic to begin with, and just wandering around until it settles down on a plot. But you see this also with like Martin Chuzzlewit, which was our last one. That American episode was just kind of dropped in a desperate attempt to goose sales. So now we have Dombey Son. And what's interesting about this, so I did a little research behind this, and that's how I found out this was the first fully plotted one, but that also Vanity Fair by William Thackeray was being published at the same time, and this was outselling Thackeray. Now what's interesting, of course, is not many people read, if you're going to read Dickens, very few people read Dombey Son. It's a standard Dickens length, so yes, usually the Dickens people read are the shortest ones, like Tale of Two Cities and A Christmas Carol. And Great Expectations also pretty short. That said, and Vanity Fair, is, people continue to read it. Becky Sharp is a very lively character in Vanity Fair. It's very interesting. There's some other interesting characters too. Dombey Son doesn't really have as many colorful or interesting characters as many of the other Dickens novels, and definitely fewer than my favorite. One of the things, though, is it seems very claustrophobic and constrained, and maybe this is a result of him planning out the plot that kind of restricted himself. This feels restricted in the number of characters and the situations they are in. It's focused really on two people. And it's not Dombey and son, it's Dombey and daughter. So the story behind this is Mr. Dombey is some rich businessman. He has a wife, and this is at the beginning of the novel. She's giving birth to their son that he has been waiting for all this time, because the name of his company is Dombey and Son. He had been the son. He had inherited from his own father, and then I'd say he's about 45, maybe 50 years old when the novel begins. So it's getting pretty old in that day and age, and he doesn't have a son. What he does have is a daughter, and she's about 6 years old when the novel begins. So what happens, of course, he has his life bound up in thinking about the son, how the son is going to take over the business and run the business. There's an interesting contrast here between Mr. Dombey and old Martin Chuzzlewit from the prior novel. Old Martin Chuzzlewit is also rich, but old Martin Chuzzlewit basically, at the beginning of the novel, distrusts everybody because he thinks they're all out for his money, and he's got reason to believe that. Mr. Paul Dombey, the older man, he has a lot of money, and he thinks he can control people with it. He doesn't mind that people are after his money. He expects it. He expects his money can control other people's behavior, and his money can do everything he wants and get him what he wants. Of course, this being Dickens, that's not what happens. To start out with, his first wife dies as part of childbirth. Not long. His son is only a few hours old, and his wife dies from childbirth, and his daughter is right there. Okay, so Florence Dombey, his daughter, is the one set in opposition. There's no real villain between the two of them. Mr. Dombey eventually relents towards his daughter towards the end. There's a whole thing there. And there's two other major characters that kind of intersect with Florence and Mr. Dombey. And that's his second wife, Edith Dombey, and his business manager, Mr. Carker, James Carker. Again, so Carker has been a suck-up all these years, essentially running the business, while Mr. Dombey hasn't been paying close attention to what the business is doing because he has been so distracted with his own son. Oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that son who was born, he dies when he's about seven years old. It's not given what he died of. The assumption is it's tuberculosis. And this is something that's interesting. Tuberculosis, if you read a lot of 19th century literature, watch opera, a lot of people die of tuberculosis. It's associated with poor living conditions, but even rich people died of tuberculosis, and their money couldn't do a damn thing about it. And that's one of the things that keeps coming up, is the futility of Mr. Dombey's money. It can't prevent people from dying. You can buy the best medical attention that's available at the time, can't do a damn thing, they die. He's got his money, but he can't control his second wife. She's got a mind of her own. She's a very interesting character. And Mr. Parker is the kind of person that old Martin Chuzzlewit would have expected. He is a dishonest dealer, and he is altering accounts and doing all sorts of things to which will ultimately ruin Mr. Dombey. He goes bankrupt before the end, and it's a hard crash. So, as I said, it's not a favorite one of mine. I did find this article, so let me switch to the screen. So, John Mullan's favorite Dickens evidently is Dombey Son, and it sounds like it's because of Florence. Florence is actually probably his best female protagonist. Now, you might think, well, she loves her father. This is the thing. She's love. She's innocent love. She loves her father, even though he does not return that love. He actually distrusts her because it's not driven by money. He doesn't understand this. Also, he's very proud. He thinks he's the center of the world, and he thinks his money can maybe not make people love him, but respect him, and it should prevent other people from loving Florence. But of course, Florence freely gives love and freely receives love, except for Mr. Dombey. She has her own revelation when he slaps her. And I'm not getting into the details. It's not because of spoilers. It's just you have to read the novel for yourself to see how it leads up to that. And she realizes the idea she had of her father was totally false. And she runs away, gets married, goes to sea, and other stuff. There is a reconciliation at the end, but it takes changes more from Mr. Dombey than from Florence to make that happen. Florence always behaves correctly. But she is no whimpering ninny. Okay? She's intelligent, and she gets things done when things need to get done. So it's kind of interesting. There's only one other thing I want to note, and it's kind of a background element that foregrounds in the plot at one point, and it's the railroad. So this was written, and I'm looking at this monthly serial from 1846 to 1848. I'm not going to look up the history of the railroads in England, but they were really spreading around England at the time. And there's a set of characters, the Toodles family. Mr. Toodles is a stoker on the railroad, and where he lives, it's kind of a relatively rundown suburb of London, and it gets replaced by a train station, and it all gets uprooted, and they move elsewhere. So you see in the background, so this goes over about a 12-year period, this novel, because, of course, Florence grows up from being a girl to being a woman, a married woman, with her own children by the end. And you see that, they're going around in carriages, but a lot of the travel is by train. There's an interesting point where Mr. Dombey is going to Brighton, I think, from London via train, and he's looking out the window, or maybe it's a different sea resort. It doesn't matter where he's going. He's by train, and you get the impression of him looking out the window and things going by rapidly. But the really interesting part, of course, is a train runs over Mr. Carker. So he's a villain, so he gets a villain's death. And it is amazing. And it is the most gruesome, I would say it's the most gruesome of Dickens' death, because it sounds like Mr. Carter gets dismembered, getting hit by the train, and it's partially an accident. He's on the rails, just kind of walking, and he gets surprised by seeing Mr. Dombey. It's not that he wants to die. It's just he's not paying a huge amount of attention. He's a bit distracted, and it really is just a tragic accident. But he gets his villain's death, and just they say there's a figure covered with a sheet or something. It must be nasty. What happened to Mr. Carter? Anyway, that's Dombey and Son. It is interesting. It's very close. It's very psychological. So that's what's interesting. I would call this one of the first really psychological of Dickens' novels, because you really get to see what certain characters think, specifically Mr. Dombey and Florence Dombey, but you get a little bit of it from Edith and Mr. Carter and a couple other characters, but you really get a deep dive into how Florence thinks and feels and how Mr. Dombey thinks and feels. So I find that very interesting. Anyway, so that's this month. We'll move on to something else for July and move on from the